We have already talked about the Section 1983 claims and some of the history and that sort of thing that goes into how those claims originated and how they are now brought. But today I want to take a look at a common law claim brought in the Karen Reid complaint, and the common law claim for malicious prosecution deserves some explanation. Here's what we're talking about today. When the government brings charges against someone, the stakes could not be higher. Your liberty, your reputation, your future, all of it hangs in the balance. But what happens when a prosecution isn't just wrong, it's malicious? When the power of the state is used not to seek truth, but to settle scores, protect friends, or hide misconduct. Today, we're going to explore the tort of malicious prosecution, where it came from, what wrongs it was designed to prevent, and how it applies to one of the most widely followed cases in the country, Karen Reid's lawsuit against members of the Massachusetts State Police and others. To understand the modern tort, we have to go back all the way to English common law. Hundreds of years ago, courts recognized a growing problem. People were using criminal accusations to wage personal vendettas. In a society where imprisonment, public shaming, or even execution could follow an accusation, the stakes were enormous. The courts realized that if there was no remedy, no check on people who were falsely accused on purpose, with malice, then the legal system itself could become a weapon. So the tort of malicious prosecution emerged. Its purpose was simple: stop people from corrupting the justice system by bringing charges without cause and with an improper motive. As the centuries passed, the principle expanded. Abuse wasn't limited to criminal accusations. People could weaponize civil lawsuits too, filing baseless claims to harass rivals or gain strategic advantages. And so the tort grew to cover both criminal and civil proceedings. So, what's the common theme? The legal process must never be used as a sword to harm the innocent. So, let's talk about what the tort was designed to remedy. Malicious prosecution exists because being prosecuted is inherently damaging, even if you are ultimately acquitted. You incur legal fees, your name becomes public, and sometimes your address too. Your job may be jeopardized. In fact, many times people are terminated from their positions when criminal charges are filed. Not so much because anybody believes they're guilty, but because they don't want the blowback if they are guilty. In addition to that, mental and physical health take a devastating hit. One of the primary leading contributors to heart disease is an increase in personal stress, and certainly this kind of thing could increase your risk of heart attack. And of course, in criminal cases, you may be arrested, detained, placed under restrictive pretrial conditions, not allowed to see or talk to certain people. In fact, it may crimp your style in terms of getting information to help you defend your case. The tort is not about punishing honest mistakes. The law expects investigators and prosecutors to make judgment calls, and yeah, sometimes they get it wrong. But malicious prosecution is triggered when the system is abused, when someone pushes forward a case knowing it's baseless, or worse, when they use the courts to hide their own misconduct, retaliate against others, or create a false narrative. That's at the heart of this tort. There are two branches of malicious prosecution. The first is criminal malicious prosecution, and this applies when someone is wrongfully charged with a crime. It often involves fabricated evidence, misleading statements to investigators, withholding exculpatory facts, or exerting pressure on law enforcement to prosecute. In our firm, we had a case involving a certain insurance company that's widely known in the United States that had written a fire policy on a barn in a rural area. The barn burned, and the insurance investigator believed, even though he had no evidence of it, that it was arson. And he pushed and pushed and pushed and got the state to prosecute the couple for arson. They were acquitted by a jury. We took the malicious prosecution case and won it at trial. So these are the kinds of cases that remedy the situation when someone abuses a close relationship between, for example, a insurance investigator and a prosecutor to essentially create havoc on one of their own customers because they don't want to pay to rebuild a barn. That's pretty low if you ask me. Now, civil malicious prosecution is sometimes called abuse of civil process. And this applies when someone files a baseless civil lawsuit not to vindicate rights, but to harm, intimidate, or burden the other side. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come in with lawsuits that might have been somewhat meritorious. In other words, they might have had a good case if all of the facts that they told me checked out. But normally they would say this one thing, and it caused me to say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. And that is, I don't even care if we win. You can keep the entire amount of money we get. I just want to make them suffer. Well, if that's your reason for going into a lawsuit, in other words, not to vindicate your rights, but to impose harm on someone else, no lawyer worth his salt is going to get involved. And we don't. So, as a result of that, I always turned those cases down because people can't use the legal system wrongly like that. The elements are similar in both cases, but criminal malicious prosecution usually produces the most severe damages because a person's liberty is at stake in that situation. Civil prosecution, again, you can win perhaps legal fees and some damage if it occurs, but it is not nearly as emotional a tort and not the kind of tort that gets juries upset as much as is a criminal prosecution. So, what are the elements of malicious prosecution? And while the exact language varies by state, the elements are remarkably consistent across American law. A plaintiff must generally prove five things. The defendant initiated or continued a proceeding. This doesn't just mean filing charges, it means providing false information, pressuring law enforcement, or omitting crucial facts in a way that ensures an innocent person is prosecuted. Courts look at whether the defendant was a substantial factor in causing the prosecution to occur. Were they the person who called 911? Were they the one who wrote a statement saying that things that never happened did happen? Those are the kinds of facts that can cause the liability to occur. The proceeding ended in the plaintiff's favor. This is essential. You cannot sue for malicious prosecution if your underlying case is still pending. The termination must reflect the plaintiff's innocence, such as an acquittal, or a dismissal for lack of evidence, or a withdrawal of the charges under circumstances that indicated they lacked merit. Lack of probable cause. This is often the battleground. Probable cause is a reasonable basis to believe the accused committed the offense. If the defendant lacked probable cause, meaning no reasonable person in their position would have believed guilt, this element is satisfied. How is it often proved? Well, through fabricated evidence. It ignored exculpatory facts, contradictions that were not explored by the investigating officers. All of these can show that probable cause was manufactured or assumed recklessly. Malice or improper purpose. Malice in this context does not mean personal hatred. It means bringing case for reasons other than genuine law enforcement or for justice. Examples include retaliation, covering up one's own wrongdoing, which is what's asserted in Karen Reid's case, protecting friends, again asserted in Karen Reid's case, political pressure, or deflecting blame. Again, obvious in Karen Reid's case. Malicious prosecution can cause catastrophic harm, lost wages, emotional distress, physical problems, legal fees, reputational destruction, and stigma, lifelong stigma from being arrested and detained, being pictured coming into court in an orange jumpsuit, for example, flashed across the front page of your local newspaper. All of these kinds of things are stigmatizing, and they can be very hard to get over. And people will often see the picture on the front page, and they'll miss that story on page 32 at the bottom of the page, which says all charges were dismissed. And that's essentially what people count on. The tort recognizes all of these things as actionable. Because the tort is serious, and because the law wants people to report crimes, defendants have several legitimate defenses. First of all, probable cause existed. If there was an objectively reasonable basis to bring charges, the claim usually fails, even if the prosecution later collapses. But again, how that reasonable basis and how that probable cause was established are very much at issue. Advice of counsel. If the defendant consulted a neutral prosecutor or attorney in good faith and followed that advice, in many states that defeats malice. Truthful reporting. Reporting truthful information that leads to a prosecution, even if later shown to be incomplete, is not malicious prosecution. In other words, if you see your neighbor abusing his child and you call the state and tell them that, and that person is later arrested but then acquitted, they are not going to have a claim that you violated their rights under the malicious prosecution tort because you did have probable cause, you actually saw the abuse happen, and you made a truthful report. Immunities. Prosecutors have absolute immunity for decisions that are intimately tied to the judicial phase. Police officers may have qualified immunity, and depending on the state and circumstances, that may be the end of the operation. Governmental entities may have protection under tort claims acts. You may recall in the Karen Reid civil case, they had to file a document with the state indicating that they were planning to sue them. Essentially, this is supposed to give the state time to evaluate the claim and decide whether to settle. The number of times when the state decides to settle is very, very small. And then lack of favorable termination. If the prior case ended in a way that does not clearly reflect innocence, the malicious prosecution claim typically cannot proceed. So if there was no acquittal, they simply got to the point where there was a mistrial, and then the state decided not to bring the action again, well, then there is no malicious prosecution. So you can sort of see where, in this case, by virtue of bringing a second prosecution against Karen Reid, the state and a lot of these folks sort of dug their own grave. Now that we've covered the history, the elements, and the defenses, let's look at how this plays out in a real case, one that captivated the nation, the prosecution and acquittal of Karen Reid. Karen Reid was charged with second-degree murder in the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe. After a long and highly publicized trial, she was acquitted on all charges in June of 2024. Following that acquittal, she filed a civil lawsuit in Massachusetts State Court against multiple defendants, including members of the Massachusetts State Police, alleging, among other things, common law malicious prosecution. That claim appears at page 40, paragraph 148 of her full complaint. Let's walk through how her allegations line up with the elements of the tort. The initiation of the prosecution. Reid alleges that certain investigators ignored exculpatory evidence, manufactured or shaped facts, provided false or misleading information, and steered the investigation toward her specifically to protect other people. According to the complaint, these actions were not passive errors. They were deliberate decisions that contributed directly to the prosecution. Favorable termination. This element is clear. A jury acquitted Reid on all charges related to the murder, and the vehicular leaving the scene of an accident. That's the strongest form of favorable termination. Now, she was convicted on the DUI, and how that plays into the tort in Massachusetts is unclear. But again, at least with respect to the murder, which is clearly the much more damaging allegation, she did get a favorable termination. Lack of probable cause. The lawsuit asserts that probable cause was absent from the beginning and was artificially created. Among the allegations in the complaint, that O'Keefe's injuries were inconsistent with a vehicular strike, that no damage matched Reid's SUV. There was no blood or DNA on Reid's SUV. The house where O'Keefe was last known to be present was never searched. Witness statements were coordinated or rehearsed. Allegedly, inculpatory evidence was collected over the course of a week, and whether it was there on the night that he was found in the snow is highly suspect at this point. Cell phone data, location data, temperature data from the cell phone communications, all of these were allegedly either suppressed or ignored. Investigators disregarded alternative suspects and contradictory physical evidence. If proven, these claims are precisely the kind of conduct courts recognize as undermining probable cause. Malice and improper purpose. The complaint alleges that investigators were motivated not by a desire to solve O'Keefe's death, but by loyalty to friends or family inside the house where the altercation allegedly occurred, institutional protectionism within the Massachusetts State Police, in other words, the big blue wall of silence, and a rush to develop a narrative that placed blame on Reid regardless of the evidence. These are the classic improper purposes in malicious prosecution law. And as for damages, Reid asserts enormous damages: destruction of reputation, severe emotional and physical distress, financial ruin from legal fees, and the trauma of facing a potential life sentence for a crime she never committed. A malicious prosecution claim, if proved, compensates plaintiffs for exactly this kind of harm. Malicious prosecution is a centuries-old remedy designed to protect the public from the abuse of legal power. It doesn't punish honest mistakes. Malicious prosecution is a centuries-old remedy designed to protect the public from the abuse of legal power. It doesn't punish honest mistakes. It punishes intentional misconduct. As the Karen Reid civil case moves forward, the courts will have to decide whether the allegations in her complaint fit the elements. It's an ancient tort, but it's still very much vital. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you being here today. If you have the opportunity today, try to do one kind thing to help somebody else. Any kind thing will do. Buy somebody a Coke, get them a cup of coffee. Anything that makes their day better, that would be a way to help make the world a better place. Because after all, isn't that what we're all after? Now, YouTube has a few things that they think you might be interested in, and they're going to be showing you that right up there.